Hello and welcome to Series 4 of the Lawyers Coach podcast. My name is Oliver Hansard, and each episode of this podcast will feature myself or Claire Rason, both of us coaches and former lawyers, trying to find out what makes lawyers tick. We will be hearing from various guests and experts, and then at the end of each episode, we will both be reflecting on what they said. The Lawyers Coach podcast is brought to you by Client Talk and Hansard Coaching. Dana Denis-Smith is the CEO of Obelisk Support. She is also the founder of the First 100 Years project. In this episode, she speaks to Claire Rason about why it's so important that we look back in order to move forward. They speak about how to get more women into leadership and some of the challenges that, in the past, have got in the way. Claire starts by asking Dana why she became a lawyer in the first place.
This is a very good question because I came to law a little later. My first career was in journalism. So I loved words. And when I decided to become a lawyer, I thought it was just another way of using words, really. And that, as long as I was interested in the meaning behind words and how they are used in the legal space, it's a perfect transition from journalism to law. And in fact, the reason why it even crossed my mind, because I never contemplated a career in law before, was because I started dating a lawyer. So the usual, you end up dating, and then I ended up marrying a lawyer, and they always try to put you off. So my future husband said, that is the craziest idea ever. I shouldn't be a lawyer. I don't need to be a lawyer. It's enough with him in the family. But I was very interested in transactions and, how law played out. And so I decided to go for a city law firm career. And really, I generally thought it was just another way of using words, similar to journalism, but slightly differently.
And having come to it later, I guess you had some expectations of what it would be like. How did the reality meet with some of those expectations that you might have had?
Well, I think I had expectations around the culture of excellence, really, that I thought I'll learn from. So there was one aspect around, what is the standard in these firms, and what else can I learn that will serve me long term. And then I tried not to have expectations around promotions and how they value people and how you make it, so to speak. I didn't try to put pressure on myself to say, well, unless by this age I'm this senior or whatever, I would feel that I succeeded or failed. So I kind of tried to take day by day, really, because I didn't know what to expect, but I knew there'd be a learning curve. I just didn't know whether it would fit me or suit me. And I think when I arrived quite early on, I realized that there was a side of myself that is very creative, always looking at problems from a very different angle. And I'm not a conformist. I just never was. And I like to challenge reality. And it wasn't necessarily an environment that was valuing that way of looking at problems in a very different way, at least when I started, which was 2005. And I wasn't sure of my longevity in that environment, because I do love ideas, and I love ideas that I can execute on, and I need that. That's probably why I became an entrepreneur. So I wasn't sure, because there was too much kind of operational kind of conformity that was required, that I wasn't necessarily responding with much love to. But equally, I recognized that there was a standard at which we were operating. I was in one of those magic circle law firms that I think gives you almost like a false sense of reality once you come out of that environment and you work in a different economy, in the real economy, so to speak. You realize how much, that kind of culture of excellence really affects you, and in a good way, because you have very high standards coming out in terms of how you run anything you touch going forward. And that's a really valuable skill to have, whatever you end up doing.
That's interesting. There's some parallels there with my journey, which are interesting. One of the reasons we always start with a question about why did you become a lawyer is because I think it's interesting for listeners to hear where people started their journeys. And I think, one of the things that I've enjoyed as I speak to different guests is the different ways that people have come into law. And I want to kind of touch on that idea of journeys, because it's at the heart of one of the projects that you have executed on. You mentioned you like having ideas and executing on them. And one of the things that you're well known for is the First 100 Years project. So I wonder if you can tell me a bit about that, why you came to come up with the idea, what it is, and a bit about the journeys that you've found out about.
So once I qualified as a lawyer, I didn't stay very long to practice. I became an entrepreneur. So 10 years ago, I started my own business, and the model of the business was to re-engage women into the workplace in the legal profession, especially around their parental responsibilities. So one of the things that I think I picked up, but I wasn't, if you like, doing anything about when I was in practice in the city around these big firms, is that I picked up that women were leaving, and I also picked up that the men were in charge. I didn't do anything about it. I didn't know what it really meant. I guess at some level it disengaged me, because I felt at some level like a lot of the women that were leaving, nobody fought for me to stay, to persuade me that I've got great leadership or great potential. They were quite comfortable for women to leave. And I guess at some level, for me to leave once I qualified wasn't a difficult decision, because nobody was saying, but why don't you stay? You've qualified, the world can benefit from another employment lawyer, especially in today's world, right? For sure, that's true. So there was this kind of sense of, the leadership was of one type, tended to be very homogenous, and women were not there. So for me, I wanted to create, if you like, a path for women to return and stay in, and actually not to leave completely. So I created a whole business around this. So Obelisk was built out of this idea of, we're educating girls, we're training them, we qualify them, they have children, then we suddenly say, you're no good. That can't be right. We need to change that. And can we create an outsourcing organization that sends work to people's homes, and gives them the flexibility to work around the families, so they don't say, I'm gone for good. I'm just working in a different way. And then part of that, journey of discovery for my business, I realized this kind of sense of belonging wasn't there for women. They didn't feel, for them, law was a place to stay and thrive and become, equal to those men that were at the very top. And I guess that was something that I picked up when I was in practice. I kind of consolidated with my business, because I interacted with hundreds of women that basically said, nobody wants me because I'm a mom. So what? I was a city lawyer. And I was kind of going against the grain, saying, but you're great, you can still be great. And one day I happened to be coming across this photograph of Herbert Smith. I think they were celebrating 150 years of the firm or something. And it was just one woman in the group of partners. And I just had this one light bulb moment when I realized it was 1982. It was within my lifetime. And I was thinking, well, maybe this is the answer. The reason why these women don't feel they belong is because, look, this group only 30 years ago, so hardly had any women, how could they feel they belonged in that group? And what kind of socializing was going on to be a partner in this kind of organization then? And what effort was there made for them to feel welcome? And so that kind of photograph really brought all these kind of thoughts that I'd gathered over my whatever number of years would have been in law, 8 or so, and kind of suddenly just gave me an answer. And I realized we knew nothing about history. There was no sense, if you did a kind of poll of people that I knew in law, when do you think women were allowed to be lawyers? I would have anything, like hundreds of years difference in terms of, when they thought the start date was. There was no understanding of how recent it was, 1919, and that it took a change in law for women to be allowed to join the professions. And I realized that if we don't start the kind of narrative from the very beginning, we're constantly moving the, you know, the post, the kind of, we never feel like we are achieving any goals because it's constantly shifting, right? So you're thinking, well, you know, I can't get to be a partner, but then why not expect a firm that's 200 years old to have more women partners? What is the expectations based on the reality today or on a heritage basis, you know? And I realized we had no way of quickly answering this kind of objections around, but we haven't got good enough women around, or there's just not enough women. And actually all the data was completely focused in one direction, which was women are coming in bigger numbers. But then the pushbacks and the objections were all around not enough good women, not enough want to be partners, not enough whatever. And I just thought this somehow doesn't add up. And so I started the first 100 years to create this kind of disciplined history, if you like, of women in law. Let's look from the beginning. What happened? How did they come to be in the profession? What did it take for them to join? And actually, if you like, even the kind of footing on which we started wasn't an empowering footing. It wasn't an act saying, all women join the legal profession. The footing was a negative one because it was about removing a disqualification. It was all around, you know, kind of a little bit of barrier removal, but actually the structure remained the same. Nothing really changed other than we said, well, you if you so wish, you can have a woman now. And of course, most of them didn't want a woman. So for a very long time, there were, you know, hardly any women practicing because nobody wanted to work with them. And I tried to kind of create this, you know, timeline of the history of women and their journey in the legal profession to show them the pace change, the fact that once you get to a kind of majority number like we have in the solicitor side, something fundamental can change in the structure of the profession. But you need to start to articulate those goals. What are they? Because otherwise, and you will know better than me, what are you chasing? It's not enough to just constantly say, well, it's not working for me, but what would work for you? Because for a while, if you are the only one in the room, you might say, you know, this isn't working for me, it's hard. But actually, when you are 51% in the room, then it's not good enough to say, well, there's a structure. You can change the structure. You should seek to change the structure. So you need to come up with ideas about what good looks like. And I felt that we needed that kind of understanding of the history to be able to say, okay, so it's not working, but what would work?
So many questions I could ask you off the back of that. I'm gonna start with a question about that history, and what for you has been some of the highlights of the journey that you've presumably been on as you've been, you know, talking to people, uncovering facts that perhaps you didn't know before. What have been some of the highlights for you from what you've been doing and what you've been hearing?
Everything's been a highlight, if I'm honest, because when I started in the legal profession, I didn't start with any kind of, as I said, you know, I didn't have a very, I tried to be flexible because I recognized it was my second career. I was coming to it later than others. I was older than the other trainees. And I didn't want to kind of set myself up either to fail or to kind of just create the wrong framework for why I was going into law. And obviously, when I left, I wasn't, you know, in any way enchanted by what I'd seen. I did see how things weren't working for a lot of people. So, you know, for me, then to have started this project and to have led the campaign for the centenary has shown me a legal profession in a completely different light. And that's just been, if you like, an incredible honor to have had the opportunity, because when you are starting off, and I left very junior, you know, I wasn't the kind of QC or partner level or whatever. Literally, I was a new qualifier when I left. To have returned and to have kind of gathered around this campaign so many people that are, you know, idols in the legal profession, so many women that nobody had heard of that are just incredible stories. It's an incredible privilege. I mean, I'm, you know, obviously I know I've created it and I started it all, but, you know, equally you can't guarantee that people will follow through with you. You know, you can have a vision, but you're never sure. the vision is only really as good as the followers that believe in it, right? So I was thrilled that people understood the importance of this landmark, that we needed to frame the story of women in a bigger narrative, and to have had the opportunity to, you know, sit down with Lady Hale on numerous counts, you know, with Supreme Court justices, to, you know, senior judges, partners from law firms. I mean, so many senior people in leadership positions that have been enthusiastic supporters of the project. It's just, so every single day that I've worked, and I've worked over 8,000 hours on this campaign since November 2013, has been an eye-opening and a wonderful privilege for me.
And you've mentioned there about when you left the city, and, you know, I guess I'm similar to you in the same regard, because I left, you know, I was, you know, relatively newly qualified, and I left the city, and you know, and part of the reason why I left was I thought, you know, I want to have a family and I want to have a career, and I can't see these two being compatible where I currently am. So it made that decision easier for me. Jumping forward to where you are now, what conversations, you know, if you were in a law firm, a city firm now, and, you know, things will have changed over the course of the past 20 years, but what conversations do firms need to be having now to make them more inclusive, to make them, you know, make those women stay?
I think the most significant change that needs to happen is to not have this view that women have a commitment problem because they have children. There's an assumption, and that, to be honest, again, it's explained by history, because obviously if you have, and it's not just in the UK, across the world, you know, there was the marriage bar that basically said once you're married, you're out. It was almost like a public shame to be a married woman to work, because unless you were from a very, you know, poor background, in the middle classes or above, it wasn't the thing to do because you had to be kept by a man. And this is a very, very, very old-fashioned way of looking at women and their aspiration, especially when they are equally educated. You can't do this anymore to a generation of highly educated people that have their own minds and they have their own ambitions, you know? So this idea that we assume a woman that gets married or is in a relationship and wants to have a family is somehow, you know, it's got an expiry date on her, is just wrong. It's sexist, really, and it's totally unrelated to what they feel and what they want. So to me, the conversation has to start around, what is it that you want? Do you want to be in leadership? When is a good time to be a leader? What does it take to be in leadership? And again, move the conversation something positive around, this is the path forward, this is how it works. And, you know, not pretend that these people don't have families, because men and women have families, but not hold women to a higher standard around what that means for their career and for their aspiration. I think definitely too many people in positions of decision making in law firms still make assumptions around a woman's commitment to work once she has a family. And that's where it all starts going wrong, because you then start taking them off the deal, taking them off the right, you know, lucrative clients. You're not considering them as a legitimate heir to your practice. And you basically then finding a way to eliminate the opportunity for them to be partners, because at the end of the day, if you want to be a partner, you've got to create opportunities for a whole pyramid below you, right? And you need to be clear that you've got to do that. And these conversations have to happen much earlier, but too often I think there is an expiry date, there's a shelf life on women, and that's why they leave, because they feel it's black and white for them.
And I watched your TEDx talk in kind of preparation for the interview today, and one of the things that really struck me, and it, you know, it's funny again how these things, you know, dots connect up, and you started your talk with a ring and speaking about the things that, you know, are passed down through the generations, and perhaps the things that are passed down through the female line are things like perhaps jewelry or, the wedding dress that you wore. Whereas the things that men pass down are perhaps different. Perhaps their stories about how they made it in their career, and this, difference between, seeing women as the heart of the family, and seeing men as the leaders and the people that have careers. And I love the fact that you're changing the narrative around women in terms of, there are stories of women that have had careers, and these are things that you should pass down. And I've got 4 children, and hopefully my children can see from me what I've done in my career. But I wonder whether also there's a part to play for men to change the narrative and start talking about them as family men. Do you think there is something there around changing the narrative around men too?
For sure. I mean, the thing is that the reality from a kind of, a huge time span point of view is that you have a narrative of leadership that comes through the male line, at least in the Western world. And you can't deny that. I mean, the way to address it is not necessarily to put men in the home, for sure. Yes, we can talk more about men in the home, but for women not to always reject the heritage of the woman that went before them, which is one of the things that I tried to achieve with the first 100 years, was to say, well, name a woman that you admire. Because too often, if you ask women to say, well, who is your role model? There'll be some guy. You never have a guy that names a woman. I've never met a man that says, my role model is a woman, except for maybe, but it wasn't just the one, the one person that we filmed for the first 100 years. The person that inspired him to be a lawyer was the teacher. But putting men on the spot to recognize that the role of the woman is informing them, not just around the home, but informing their mind. Their mothers, are not just this kind of hugging people that are there for them in, rain or shine, but actually is passing them values. It's making them the men they are. So I feel that women have this role to play to really articulate more clearly their role in society beyond the home. And I don't think it's about putting men in the home. I think it's about us actually building on that legacy and saying, for example, I always give this example because I know I talked about it in the TEDx talk about, showing the Margaret Thatcher cabinet where she was the only woman in the middle. This idea that you have another female prime minister that rejects the former first woman prime minister, a man will never do that. A man will never say, there's no heritage and line from which I come. They basically say, no, I'm the new Churchill, I'm the new whatever. It's almost like, Hollywood film. They're like, I'm this one and this one, they always role model because they realize that storytelling, the role model, is actually a powerful tool to become credible. For me, I never understand why women reject the woman before. And they're not building. Of course, you're different. Nobody says Theresa May is the same as Margaret Thatcher. I mean, we know they're not the same. But why would you not build on the legacy? I am the second woman. I'm different in this way. This is my vision. And that's why I talked about, very often you see women in public positions, in politics especially, that don't write their memoirs. They don't leave anything. There's no trace. They may be writing something about, the world, the way I view it, but they're not saying, let me tell you about how awfully badly I've been treated in, in government or whatever. What is your perspective? Write it down. And I think that is a really important gap that we're creating. We keep the gap there. And therefore, by not filling it with views and opinions, and yes, maybe some gossip, you're not creating your own side of the story. So other people will tell it for you. And men don't make that error. I mean, you see, it doesn't matter how important they were. If they were an MP and a backbencher, they will still find a way to write some memoirs and get their story and put their story out. Of course, in order for this to happen, you also have to have the publishing world encouraging women to do this and publishing their story. So I'm not sure that's, there's so many elements that are missing still, including people don't want to write an autobiography of Theresa May, for example. It could be the assumption, but is that a kind of bias? Is it because she's refusing, or is it because actually we don't want to put that story of, us told by a woman out? And also there's a lot of there's another gap that's created, for example, and we discovered that even with the historic figures that were pretty impressive in their day, once they have children, they have less time. So they didn't have time to keep diaries and keep the gossip written down so they can piece together the autobiography when they're ready to write it. We need more stories to be told, more women to speak in their own voice, yes, and to be prepared to be criticized. But that view has to be documented. Otherwise, it's a passing, tweet, and future generations will never be able to, basically put that perspective across, because it is going to be a battle of perspectives, right? That's how history is interpreted. And then who will speak for us in the future if we're leaving no written document to show what we thought?
And do you think it's that fear of criticism that's stopping these stories?
For sure, there is a fear of scrutiny and quite violent responses that women are suffering around basically being shut down. And when you look at the kind of how role models are made, voice is an important characteristic in that, being able to vocalize, to be able to stand up on the stage, to be able to express views. And if you then have a wave of abuse back, then many people just back off.
And what have you learned from, with your company? Because I know that you're talking about lots of things that, I think firms are now just starting to wake up to, some of the flexible working, obviously forced upon many because of the pandemic, encouraging women to stay. What lessons have you learned that you would like to share with the, bigger firms, smaller firms, other firms that are grappling with, how do we keep the good women talent that we've got to progress with us rather than leave?
Well, I would say the starting point is to, I like the use of good women. Don't expect them to be outstanding and exceptional and somehow different from the good men. So hold them to the same standards is the starting position, because I think a lot of women are being made to feel they're inadequate when in fact they are exceptional. And so not kind of apply different standards for different types of people that you hire. Keeping flexible work for the long term is absolutely necessary. Women have always said they struggle. They do want to be around their family, and that's a good sign. It's a sign of a normal human being. So being able to enable them to continue to work, to be in control of their time and be trusted, I think it's very valuable. Of course, men can benefit from it, but women historically have been pushed out because of it. So if you want to keep them in, just let them have control of their time. And have more regular catch-ups with them around their aspiration and ambition. And rather than trying to dissuade them from their ambition, how about you support their ambition? So, a conversation might be, I love to be a partner. Is this the right time? I'm not quite sure. Why are we then trying to persuade the woman to ditch the plans around the partnership and try to kind of live day by day, when in fact she knows that in 10 years' time she'd like to get to the very top? How do you support that journey and review it regularly, rather than trying to say, well, maybe this is not really for you, or you don't really have the confidence, will you ever hold, get the clients? And those are all kind of can't do attitude discussions, whereas I think if you have can do attitude discussions around, okay, how do we make this possible, then you'll have a very different population in the law firm. So you will have the structural change because people will understand what it takes to succeed. So I think they're not that complicated things. I mean, paying people equally for the same job really is the law. It should be enforced. It shouldn't be moderated out through statistical models. Making assumptions about people, again, because they're married and somehow they're not as committed, is wrong. Anybody in the firm that is a parent, man or woman, would know how they feel. So I would say treat women the same, and then they will give you the best they have. But very often, I think the standards are quite differently applied.
You set up your firm a while ago now. And as I said, it's won awards and, and it solved a problem at the time. Do you think that problem is still here today?
I think so. I mean, just because we had a pandemic, it doesn't mean that everybody's learned how to accept flexibility. I mean, flexibility and working from home was a forced course of action because of a pandemic, not because employers were, dying to give it to everybody. So they've been forced down the path. I mean, a lot of firms are now varying their policies, from I'll have you in the office this number of days, that number of days. It's still very inflexible flexibility. There's very much, this kind of idea that you've got to prescribe how people work because otherwise they'll fail to work effectively. I don't subscribe to that view. I've always run a business with a dispersed workforce. We have an office. I'm interested in, playing people to their strengths, not for them to come up and, glorify me as their leader. So what is the point of the office? What is the meaning of the meetings we have to have in person? Where are you best for a particular task? And some things, to be honest, I expect them to know better than me. I'm there to guide them and to be, kind of coach to the team, but they should, and I should be encouraging them to know what they're good at and where. And not for me to say, well, if you're not in on a Tuesday, that means you're failing. I feel we're far away from really understanding how people work in a way that we trust them. And we still have this idea of really one rule for everyone, which clearly hasn't worked for a lot of women in the past. Obviously, we also had a lot of women that stepped out of the workplace because they had, childcare responsibilities. They couldn't, deal with the homeschooling, all very exceptional situations, but once out, how difficult it will be to come back in. So I definitely welcome, from a business point of view, the fact that finally the world says, if somebody wants to work from home, we don't have to argue or discuss why they don't want to come into the office. But it doesn't mean that there's no kind of movement towards, we want more people to be visible, and there's this idea that you're only valuable if you turn up, and there's a higher value once you turned up. That would be very damaging. So I think the jury's out in terms of how the future of work will shape. For me to say, is my model, definitely has been vindicated, but will it be so challenged because everybody's going to work in a way that we've worked? And plus, apart from that, people's lives require different setups at different stages in their children's development. So there's always a time where actually you might want to do less in a very different way, where no employer could give you the option, or they could give it to a very limited number of people. So for me, I'm motivated to take more jobs to as many people as possible to allow them to work in a way that works for them. And I think that mission's not going away because there's just not enough flexibility still in the workplace.
This flexibility, you've perhaps answered the question that I was thinking about carrying on from. I know you have lots of ex-city females that come and work with you, and they must share with you, what's been the driver for them to come to you, what's been the driver for them to leave the city. What is, if you had to sum up in one word, 2 words, what are the words that you hear the most in terms of why it is that females leave the city?
Well, definitely living locally and being able to manage and juggle and not, operate a zero-sum game in their life and work is definitely the main driver. So, when they had to commute, rushing to the nursery applies the fine if you're there late. It's very stressful. That kind of, bookend of a working day. I think we underestimate how much stress that creates. If you've got to be by a certain time somewhere, and then you've got to be at work by the same time, then you've got to be back by X time, because otherwise your children are, everybody's frowning at you. That is a level. I mean, we talk now about mental health and the challenge and the stress, but actually that was mental health and challenges that nobody recognized. I mean, those people were literally in a kind of harassed state. Being able to remove that and creating that flexibility around it, to be able to feel, I'm still on top of my work, I can still do this. It's incredibly empowering. And I think, to me, eliminating this kind of, the space, the way you work, where you work, when you do it, creates just a more relaxed way to work, and more, when you're more relaxed and you're happier, then you're able to, to do a good job. So I think for me, the main ones are around the kind of stress of trying to be perfect in all, in life and work, and feeling that you're constantly failing on all fronts. And there's enough guilt in parenting anyway, without needing to add more to it. So that tend to be, I have a blog, and I think I've rewritten it recently around the obstacles. They tended to be around geography and control of the employer. That didn't seem to be based on trust. It was all around, can I really trust that you will do what I wanted to do, as opposed to, I trust you that you know what you're doing. They're quite different messages.
So potentially ending on a positive, because I like to end on a positive, potentially a really big opportunity now for employers, given that we've had this period where, people have, had to trust, where this myth of, you can't work from home and you can't, lots of myths hopefully have been busted over the last 18 months with the pandemic, in a way that, a real opportunity for employers going forward to be able to level some of those things that perhaps were standing in the way before.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's precisely what we should do. We should stop and, we should remember the world before. We should also remember that the world of the last 15 months is in an exceptional medical emergency. So it's not the normal way to work. And actually, when you remove that stress, you can really create a thriving, positive environment for all to thrive.
I think that's a really lovely place to end the conversation on. I just want to say thank you ever so much for your time today. I could have, as I always say, I could have spoken for much longer, but thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Claire. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
That was Claire Rason talking to Dana Denis-Smith, CEO of Obelisk Support. Claire joins me now. Claire, what was one thing that you took away from that conversation?
I think there were actually two things. So I'm going to throw two things out there. I think the first is, I think she kept coming back to this can-do attitude, and I think that's a really nice positive to take away from the conversation. And it reminded me of the conversation that I had with Miriam Gonzalez, who said, that firms should be thinking about what they would do if they would only hire women, and encourage them to do that anyway. So I thought that can do provided a nice parallel with Miriam, and was a nice takeaway for me. I think the other thing that I really liked about the conversation that I had with Dana was when she started talking about, just men being humans and wanting to spend time with their families, and that's okay. And I think, not all women have children. Not all men want to work at the expense of their family. And I think that making sure that we look at everyone as individuals, as humans, is going to be really important going forward.
Brilliant, Claire. Thanks ever so much for those reflections, and thanks for that fantastic episode.
Thanks, Oliver.
Lawyers Coach is brought to you by Client Talk and Hansard Coaching. If you're enjoying this series, please rate us on your podcast provider so that others can find us. If you're a lawyer and would like to take part in Lawyers Coach, please visit our website lawyercoach.co.uk for further details. And you can also join the conversation on our LinkedIn group Lawyers Coach. If there are any topics you'd like to hear us discuss, then just get in touch.